only adds drag, so you get all that cornering grip without sacrificing your straight-line speed. Alex. Right then, Sam. Let's talk about DRS, that little flap on the rear wing that opens up on the straights.
Sam. Yeah. When the driver's within 1 second of the car ahead in a DRS zone, they can pop that flap open.
Alex. And opening it lets air flow straight through instead of pushing down, so you shed a chunk of drag.
Alex. Let's talk brake temperatures today, Sam, because those carbon discs actually work best when they're glowing.
Sam. That's right. F1 brakes love heat. Carbon needs to be roasting hundreds of degrees. Alex. So Sam, let's chat about tire degradation today. Why a set of tires just gives up over a stint.
Sam, great one. It's really two things. There's wear, where rubber physically scrubs off the surface lap after lap.
Alex. And then there's thermal degradation. Overheat the tire and the surface goes greasy, so grip drops even with rubber left.
Sam, exactly, which is why a driver managing their pace can make one set last far longer than someone pushing flat out. Alex, let's talk DRS today, Sam. That little flap on the rear wing that opens up on the straights. Alex, but drivers can only use it in designated zones and only when they're within a second of the car ahead. It's a tool to help overtaking.
Sam, and the moment they hit the brakes, it snaps shut, because you want that downforce back when you're turning in. Alex leans in with a grin as the graphics settle on a glowing rear axle.
Alex, let's dig into ERS today, Sam. That electric boost the cars carry alongside the engine. Sam, love it. The car harvests energy that'd otherwise be wasted under braking and from heat in the turbo, then stores it in a battery. Alex, and when the driver wants it, that stored energy feeds back through a motor to give them extra horsepower down the straight. Alex, let's talk tire degradation today, Sam. Why those tires just fall off a cliff after a stint.
Sam, great one. As tires work lap after lap, the rubber heats up and slowly wears away, losing that crucial grip.
Alex, and there's thermal deg too. Overheat them and the surface gets greasy, so the driver has to manage their pace. Alex, let's talk about DRS today, Sam. That clever little wing flap that helps with overtaking.
Sam. Ooh, good pick. When a driver's within a second of the car ahead in a DRS zone, they can open a flap in the rear wing.
Alex, and opening it cuts down drag. Less air resistance means more straight line speed to make a move.
Sam. Exactly. It's like tucking your arms in on a bike to slice through the air a bit cleaner. Alex, let's dig into ground effect today, Sam. The invisible force sucking these cars to the track.
Sam, love it. Underneath the car there are shaped tunnels, and as air speeds up through them, the pressure drops.
Alex, right. Lower pressure below than above means the car gets pulled down onto the road, almost like a vacuum.
Alex, let's talk tire warm-up today, Sam. Why drivers weave around before the start.
Sam, great one. Those tires need heat to work properly. Cold rubber just slides around with barely any grip.
Alex, exactly. So they swerve and brake hard to build friction and get the rubber up into its ideal temperature window.
Alex, let's talk about
adoring home crowd. Man survived, returning to racing just 6 weeks later, with his wounds barely healed. That astonishing comeback made Lauda one of the most courageous figures the sport has ever known. Monaco, 1988, and Ayrton Senna produced a qualifying lap that seemed to belong to another world. He beat his own teammate, Alain Prost, by almost a second and a half around the tightest circuit on the calendar. Senna later spoke of driving in a kind of trance, feeling he was beyond the limits of his own conscious mind. Yet, in the race, comfortably ahead, he brushed the barrier at Poitiers and threw a certain victory away. Adelaide, 1986, the final round, and 3 men could still take the championship. Nigel Mansell needed only 3rd place to be crowned champion at last. But on the main straight, at nearly 200 miles per hour, his left rear tire exploded in a shower of sparks. He wrestled the wounded car to a halt, and with it his title hopes were gone, handed instead to Alain Prost. The old Nürburgring, 1976, more than 14 miles of forest and fear that Niki Lauda had begged his rivals to boycott. On the second lap, his Ferrari snapped sideways, struck the barrier, and burst into flames as he sat trapped inside. He suffered terrible burns and breathed in scorching toxic fumes, and a priest was called to read him his last rites. Yet just 6 weeks later, scarred and bandaged, he climbed back into the car at Monza and finished 4th. Dijon, 1979, the French Grand Prix, and behind the winner, a battle for 2nd place unfolded that many still call the greatest of all. Gilles Villeneuve in his Ferrari and René Arnoux in the Renault fought wheel than his own teammate, Alain Prost, in an identical car. Senna later spoke of a trance, of being beyond himself, driving on pure instinct through the barriers of Monte Carlo. Yet in the race, comfortably leading, he brushed the wall at Poitiers and crashed out, a haunting flaw within a moment of genius. The Nürburgring, Suzuka, 1988, and Ayrton Senna needed victory to seize his first world championship from his own teammate, Alain Prost. But at the start, his engine stalled. Adelaide, 1986, and Nigel Mansell arrived at the final race needing only 3rd place to be crowned world champion at last. With the title within his grasp and just 20 laps remaining, His left rear tire exploded at almost 200 miles an hour along the Brabham Straight. He wrestled the wounded Williams to a halt in a shower of sparks, and with it, his championship dream slipped cruelly away. The crown went instead to Alain Prost, and Mansell was left to wonder what might have been on that heartbreaking Australian afternoon. Dijon, 1979, and in the closing laps of the French Grand Prix, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux staged one of the greatest duels the sport has ever witnessed. For lap after lap, they fought wheel to wheel, banging tires, running side by side through the corners, neither man willing to yield an inch. They touched, they ran wide, and still they came back at one another, trading the position again and again in a breathless display of raw courage. Villeneuve held on to second place at the flag, and though neither won, their fearless battle became forever etched into Formula One legend.
Alex, let's talk about DRS today, Sam, the drag reduction system.
Sam. Right, so there's a flap on the rear wing that opens up when a driver's within a second of the car ahead.
Alex, exactly. Opening it cuts drag, letting the car slip through the air faster on the straights.
Sam. Less resistance, more speed, a little helping hand to make overtaking possible.
Alex, let's dig into tire warm-up today, Sam. It's more crucial than people realize.
Sam. Absolutely. These tires only work properly in a specific temperature window. Too cold, and there's almost no grip.
Alex, that's why you see drivers weaving on the formation lap, generating heat and friction to get the rubber up to temperature.
Sam, get it right, and the car sticks like glue. Get it wrong, and you're sliding around on cold, greasy tires. Alex. Today, let's talk about ground effect, Sam, the invisible force sucking these cars to the track.
Sam, love it. The floor of the car is shaped to speed up the air underneath, and faster air means lower pressure. Alex, let's talk about DRS today, Sam, that clever little flap that helps drivers overtake.
Sam, great pick. DRS stands for Drag Reduction System, and it opens a slot in the rear wing when a driver's within a second of the car ahead.
Alex, right. Opening that flap lets air pass through instead of pushing against the wing, cutting drag and boosting straight-line speed.
Sam, and it can only be used in designated zones, so it's a controlled little boost, just enough to make the racing closer and the overtakes possible. Alex, let's dig into brake temperatures today, Sam, because carbon brakes are surprisingly fussy.
Sam, they really are. Carbon brakes only work well in a hot window, often glowing bright orange under heavy braking.
Alex, right. Too cold and they won't bite. Too hot and they wear out fast. So teams manage cooling ducts carefully.
Sam, and that's why you'll see drivers weaving on the formation lap, building heat so those brakes are ready when the lights go out.
On the 1st of August, 1976, Niki Lauda crashed his Ferrari at the old Nürburgring, the fearsome 14-mile circuit he'd wanted banned as too dangerous. His car burst into flames, and he was trapped in the wreckage for nearly a minute, suffering severe burns and inhaling toxic fumes that scarred his lungs. Doctors feared the worst, yet just 6 weeks later, he returned to race at Monza, his wounds still raw beneath the bandages. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his own teammate, Nelson Piquet, by a considerable margin. With the home crowd roaring him on, Mansell mounted a furious chase, setting lap after blistering lap. At Monaco in 1988, Ayrton Senna produced a qualifying lap that seemed to belong to another world. He beat his own teammate, Alain Prost, by nearly a second and a half around the tight streets of the Principality. Senna later described feeling as though he'd transcended the car, driving on pure instinct, almost in a trance. Yet, in the race, he crashed while leading, a haunting reminder that even genius could not tame Monaco. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, the race for the lead had already been settled. But behind the winner, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux waged one of the fiercest battles the sport had ever seen. For lap after lap, they banged wheels, ran side by side, and even touched, trading second place again and again. Villeneuve just held on, and their duel became a benchmark for pure, fearless racing. On the 1st of August, 1976, Niki Lauda's Ferrari crashed and burst into flames at the fearsome Nürburgring. Trapped in the burning wreck, he suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes that damaged his lungs. He was given the last rites, yet just 6 weeks later, he returned to racing at Monza, his wounds still raw beneath the bandages. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his own teammate, Nelson Piquet, by nearly half a minute. Driving before his home crowd, Mansell hunted him down lap after lap, urged on by a roaring sea of British fans. With a daring dummy into Stowe Corner, he swept past Piquet and stormed to a famous victory. He ran out of fuel on the slowing down lap, then knelt to kiss the tarmac that had carried him home. At Monaco in 1988, Ayrton Senna produced a qualifying lap that seemed to belong to another world. He beat his own teammate, Alain Prost, by nearly a second and a half around the tight streets of the Principality. Senna later described entering a trance-like state, as if the car were driving itself and he was watching from above. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, the final laps at Dijon produced one of the greatest duels the sport has ever seen. Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought wheel-to-wheel for second place, banging tyres and running side by side through the corners. They swapped positions again and again, refusing to yield, each seemingly willing to risk everything for the place. Villeneuve held on at the line, and the two men embraced afterwards, knowing they had created something unforgettable. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda crashed his Ferrari on the treacherous Nürburgring. His car burst into flames, and he was trapped in the inferno for agonizing seconds before fellow drivers pulled him free. He suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes, and a priest was called to read him his last rites. Yet, just 6 weeks later, he returned to racing, bandages still on his head, in an act of astonishing courage. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his teammate Nelson Piquet by a large margin at his home circuit. But Mansell charged, setting a string of blistering laps as the crowd rose to their feet in expectation. With just a few laps remaining, he produced a stunning dummy at Stowe, diving past Piquet to take the lead. At the Japanese Grand Prix of 1988, At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his on the fearsome Nürburgring. Trapped in the inferno, he suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes that left him fighting for his life. Yet just 6 weeks later, his wounds still raw beneath. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell chased his teammate Nelson Piquet before a passionate home crowd at Silverstone. Trailing by nearly half a minute, he mounted a furious charge, setting the fastest lap again and again. With just 2 laps remaining, he dived past Piquet with a daring dummy at Stowe, sending the grandstands into raptures. When his car finally coasted to a halt, out of fuel, Mansell fell to his knees and kissed the very tarmac he had conquered. At the European Grand Prix of 1993, rain lashed the circuit at Donington Park. Starting 5th, Ayrton Senna produced what many still call the finest opening lap in the sport's history. By the time he swept through the final corner, he had passed 4 cars to seize the lead. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda crashed his Ferrari on the fearsome Nürburgring. His car burst into flames, and he was trapped in the inferno, suffering severe burns and inhaling toxic fumes. A priest was called to read him his last rites, yet Lauda fought back with astonishing willpower. Just 6 weeks later, his wounds barely healed, he returned to racing at Monza, defying all who had written him off. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his teammate Nelson Piquet by a considerable margin. Making a bold pit stop for fresh tyres, Mansell threw himself into a relentless pursuit before a roaring home crowd. With just 2 laps remaining, he produced a stunning dummy at Stowe Corner to snatch the lead from Piquet. The Silverstone faithful erupted, and Mansell later fell to his knees, kissing the very tarmac on which he had triumphed. At the Japanese Grand Prix of 1988, Ayrton Senna needed victory at Suzuka to claim his first world title. But as the lights went out, he stalled his McLaren, dropping down the field in an instant. Undeterred, he carved his way back through the pack, hunting down his teammate Alain Prost in changing conditions. By the end, he had taken the lead, the win, and the championship, crowning himself champion of the world for the very first time. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, the race for the win had been settled, but the battle for second was only beginning. Over the final laps, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux went wheel to wheel around Dijon, banging tyres and refusing to yield. They swapped positions again and again, sliding wide, touching, and charging back at one another with reckless bravery. Villeneuve just held on to second place, and the duel is remembered to this day as one of the greatest in the sport's history.
Alex. So Sam, let's talk about DRS. That little flap on the rear wing drivers love so much.
Sam. Right. When it's allowed, they open a slot in the rear wing, which cuts down drag and lets them go faster on the straights.
Alex, exactly. Less air resistance means a nice speed boost, perfect for closing in and setting up an overtake.
And the moment they hit the brakes, it snaps shut again, giving them back that grip for the corner. Clever bit of kit.
Alex, Sam, let's dig into tire degradation today. Why those tires just fall off a cliff sometimes.
Sam, great one. As a tire works hard, it heats up, and the rubber literally starts to break down and lose grip.
Alex, right. There's thermal deg from overheating, and physical wear as the surface grains and blisters away lap after lap. Alex, let's talk brake-by-wire today, Sam. One of the cleverest tricks on a modern F1 car.
On the first day of August in 1976, the German Grand Prix unfolded on the fearsome old Nürburgring, a track so long and treacherous that Niki Lauda himself had pleaded to have it boycotted. On the second lap, his Ferrari veered off, struck the barrier, and burst into flames, trapping the Austrian inside the burning wreck. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, held at Dijon, the race for victory had already been settled by Jean-Pierre Jabouille and his turbocharged Renault. But behind him, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux waged a battle for second place that would become legend. Over the final laps, they traded the position again and again, wheels touching, sliding side by side through the corners, refusing to yield an inch. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda crashed on the treacherous Nürburgring, his Ferrari bursting into flames. Trapped in the inferno, he suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes that scarred his lungs. Doctors feared he would not survive. Yet just 6 weeks later, he returned to race at Monza, his wounds still raw beneath his helmet. His courage in the face of such suffering remains one of the most remarkable comebacks in all of sport. At the Australian Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell arrived in Adelaide with his championship hopes already extinguished. A tyre failure in practice had sent him crashing hard into the barriers, injuring his back and forcing him to withdraw. His teammate, Nelson Piquet, had clinched the title for Williams, capping a bitter rivalry that had divided the team all season long. At the Japanese Grand Prix of 1988, Ayrton Senna needed victory at Suzuka to seize his first world championship. But, as the lights went out, his engine stalled, and he slipped backward, seemingly out of contention on the sloping grid. With extraordinary determination, he fought his way through the field, hunting down his teammate Alain Prost, lap after lap in the drizzle. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda crashed his Ferrari on the daunting Nürburgring. His car burst into flames, and he was trapped in the inferno, suffering severe burns and inhaling toxic fumes. Given the last rites in hospital, few believed he would survive, let alone race again. Yet, just 6 weeks later, he returned to the cockpit, his wounds still raw, in one of sport's greatest acts of courage. At the final round of 1986 in Adelaide, Nigel Mansell needed only third place to become world champion. But on a searing straight, with the race in his grasp, his left rear tyre exploded at nearly 200 miles per hour. Sparks streamed behind the wounded Williams as he wrestled it to a halt, his title dreams shredded on the tarmac. At Suzuka in 1988, Ayrton Senna needed to win to claim his first world championship. But as the lights went out, he stalled on the grid, dropping down to 14th place amid the charging field. What followed was a masterclass as he carved his way through the pack in changing, rain-slicked conditions. By the closing laps, he had swept into the lead, sealing the title in a drive that many still call the finest of his career. At Dijon, in 1979, the French Grand Prix produced one of the greatest battles the sport has ever seen. In the closing laps, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought wheel-to-wheel for second place, banging tyres and running side by side through the corners. They swapped positions again and again, each refusing to yield, their cars touching as they raced flat out to the flag. At the Nürburgring in 1976, Niki Lauda crashed heavily on the treacherous old circuit as his Ferrari burst into flames. Trapped in the burning wreck, he suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes, and a priest was called to read him his last rites. Yet just 6 weeks later, scarred and bandaged, he astonished the world by returning to race at Monza. At Adelaide in 1986, Nigel Mansell arrived at the final race, needing only third place to be crowned world champion. But on lap 64, running at nearly 300 kilometers an hour, his left rear tire exploded in a shower of sparks. He wrestled the Williams to a halt with astonishing skill, yet his title dream was gone in an instant. At Suzuka in 1988, Ayrton Senna needed victory to claim his very first world championship. But at the start, his engine stalled and he slipped back through the field, seemingly out of contention. In damp and difficult conditions, he charged through the pack with breathtaking speed and precision. He caught and passed his teammate Alain Prost, taking the win and the title in one of the finest drives of his career. At Dijon in 1979, the French Grand Prix produced one of the greatest battles the sport has ever witnessed. In the closing laps, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought wheel-to-wheel for second place, banging tyres through the corners. They swapped positions again and again, sliding wide, touching, and refusing to yield an inch. Villeneuve just held on to second, and their fearless duel became legend, remembered as a defining image of racing courage. At the Nürburgring in 1976, Niki Lauda crashed heavily on the long and treacherous circuit. His Ferrari burst into flames, and he was trapped in the fire, suffering severe burns and inhaling toxic fumes. Fellow drivers pulled him from the wreckage, and doctors feared he would not survive the night. Astonishingly, just 6 weeks later, he returned to racing in one of the bravest comebacks the sport has ever seen. At Adelaide in 1986, Nigel Mansell arrived at the final round, needing only to finish among the leaders to claim his first world title. But with less than 20 laps to go, and traveling at nearly 200 miles per hour, his left rear tire exploded in a shower of sparks. He wrestled the wounded Williams into an escape road, his championship dream vanishing in an instant. It was Alain Prost who seized the moment, taking the race and the crown in one of the most dramatic finales the sport has ever known.
Alex here. Let's talk about the humble radiator, because these engines run hot.
Sam jumping in. Those side pods aren't just for looks. They're channeling air over cooling elements to stop the power unit from cooking itself.
Exactly. But every opening you cut for cooling adds drag. So teams are constantly balancing temperature against speed.
It's a proper tug of war. Keep it cool enough to survive, but sleek enough to fly.
Alex here. Let's talk about brake-by-wire, because F1 stopping power is cleverer than we'd think. Sam jumping in. On the rear axle, there's no direct hydraulic link. A computer blends the friction brakes with the energy recovery system. Right. So when the driver hits the pedal, the car harvests energy and slows down, all managed electronically for a consistent feel. It's a delicate dance. The software has to juggle both, so the braking never feels twitchy under the driver's foot. Alex here. Let's chat about tire degradation, because rubber doesn't last forever out there.
Sam jumping in. As the tire works lap after lap, it heats up and the surface literally wears away, losing grip bit by bit.
And there's two flavors of it, right? Thermal deg, where the tire overheats and goes greasy, and mechanical wear, where the tread just grinds down.
Exactly. Which is why you'll see drivers babying their tires one lap, then pushing the next. Manage that dance well, and you might just steal a whole pit stop. Alex here. Let's talk about DRS, the drag reduction system, because it's basically a speed boost on demand.
Sam jumping in. There's a little flap on the rear wing, and when the driver opens it, it lays flat and lets air slip through.
Less wings sticking up means less drag, so the car punches through the air easier and gains those extra few kilometers an hour down the straight.
Alex here. Let's dig into ground effect, because it's the secret sauce under these modern cars.
Sam jumping in. The floor of the car is shaped with channels called Venturi tunnels, and as air rushes through them, it speeds up and drops in pressure.
Low pressure underneath basically sucks the car down onto the track, like an invisible hand pushing it into the tarmac. Alex here. Let's talk about tire degradation, because it's one of the biggest puzzles in a race.
Sam jumping in. Every time a tire works hard through corners, it heats up, and that heat slowly wears the rubber and reduces grip.
So a driver might be flying early on, then find the car sliding more and more as those tires fade away. Alex here. Let's talk about DRS, the little flap that gives drivers a straight line boost.
Sam jumping in. DRS opens a slot in the rear wing, letting air pass straight through instead of pushing down.
Less downforce means less drag, so the car slips through the air faster down the straight.
But it only unlocks within a second of the car ahead, in set zones. A fair little tool to help overtaking, not a free pass.
Alex here. Let's talk about ground effect, the reason these modern cars stick to the track like glue.
Sam jumping in. The floor of the car is shaped to speed air up underneath, and faster air means lower pressure.
That low pressure literally sucks the car down onto the road, giving huge grip without adding much drag.
It's why the cars can fly through fast corners. The ground itself is helping hold them down.
Alex here. Let's chat about ERS, the hybrid power that gives these cars an electric kick.
Sam jumping in. The car harvests energy that'd normally be wasted, like heat from braking and the turbo.
It stores that in a battery, then deploys it back through a motor for a big burst of extra horsepower.
So, the same energy that slows the car down helps fire it out the other side. Clever recycling at 300 kph.
Alex here. Let's talk about DRS, that little wing flap that helps cars overtake.
Sam jumping in. DRS opens a slot in the rear wing, letting air flow straight through instead of pushing down.
That cuts drag on the straights, so the chasing car gets a top speed boost to close the gap.
But it only works in special zones when you're within a second of the car ahead. Keeps things fair and exciting.
Alex here. Let's talk about ground effect, the secret to how these cars stick to the track.
Sam jumping in. Underneath the floor, there are shaped tunnels that speed the air up as it rushes through.
Faster air means lower pressure below the car, so it gets sucked down onto the tarmac like a vacuum.
And the beauty is, it grips them through corners without adding much drag. Downforce, almost for free.
Alex here. Let's talk about tire warm-up, because cold rubber is basically useless.
Sam jumping in. Tires only grip properly in a specific temperature window, so drivers weave around to build heat.
Too cold, and they slide. Too hot, and the rubber overheats and starts falling apart.
That's why the outlap after a pit stop is so nervy. The grip just isn't there yet.
Alex here. Let's talk about DRS, the overtaking helper on these cars.
Sam jumping in. DRS stands for Drag Reduction System, and it's a flap in the rear wing that opens up.
When it opens, the air flows through instead of pushing back, so drag drops and top speed climbs.
But it only unlocks within a second of the car ahead. A little gift to help you get alongside on the straight.
Alex here. Let's chat about ground effect, the thing sucking these cars to the track.
Sam jumping in. Underneath the floor, there are shaped tunnels that speed the air up as it passes.
Faster air means lower pressure below the car, so the whole thing gets pulled downward like a giant suction cup.
And the beauty is, it barely adds drag, so you get grip in the corners without paying for it on the straights.
Alex here. Let's talk about tire degradation. Why these cars slow down as a stint goes on.
Sam jumping in. As the rubber heats up and wears, it loses grip and lap times start to creep up.
There are two flavors: thermal deg, where the tire overheats, and physical wear, where the rubber literally sheds away.
And that's the whole game of strategy. Nurse those tires too long and you're a sitting duck, but pit too early and you throw away track position.
Alex here. Let's talk about DRS, the drag reduction system that helps cars overtake.
Sam, jumping in. There's a flap on the rear wing that pops open when a driver's close enough behind.